Ladies and gentlemen, for his final performance of the evening, Anthony.
So I'm going through the story entitled Swamp now. By the late 1950s, the oppression of Buddhists in Vietnam had become brutal. Meanwhile, in Lexington, I was just a boy and was concerned with other matters, like bullfrog. The bullfrog in the swamp near my house was humongous. He was black, long-legged, and faster than imagination. I suppose we called it the swamp because it was a stagnant, scum-coated pool of water, and even though it was only a bit larger than your ordinary suburban home footprint. Sparsely wooded land and rocks big enough to climb up on surrounded it. And there was plenty of scrub vegetation, and vines were hanging here and there. It lay in the middle of the next lot over, where one day a large house would stand. But from 1957, when I came across it, until 1963, it served as our rainforest, animal refuge, scenes for Black Lagoon monster fantasies, and the center of our wildlife experiences. In short, it was the other side of the world, 60 feet from the house. All of us neighborhood kids and our dogs went there alone and in packs to see salamanders and their clear ribbons of eggs, tadpoles, garter snakes, toads, snapping turtles, and the fish we called carp. We'd go to the poke sticks and toss rocks, and especially to meditate on bullfrog. He was around every spring, bullfrog was, and all summer, and a good part of each fall. And legend held that in winter, he retired to the mud on the swamp floor, where he'd suspend himself under the ice cover, growing larger in silent darkness. Still, impenetrable, employing the mad yogic skills that we'd heard about, until March, just after the arrival of the brave crocuses, when he'd reappear to mystify and elude us for another season. You could never get too near him. It was as if he had a scanner somewhere on the lot. He'd leap virtually before the first sound of a footstep crackle, and you'd hear the borp, followed by a parting and closing of green slime. Sometimes, if you'd been there a while, you might catch a glimpse of his eyes piercing the surface. Usually you'd see his entirety only in mid-flight from the swamp's edge, fully extended for an instant before he'd slip beneath the murk, and you counted yourself fortunate to have had such a vision. I respected him in a strange way, and I was also a little afraid of him. Something to do with the sensational chasm between us. He represented a tremendous mystery, and I was awed by the namelessness of what I sometimes felt. How did he actually live in the winter? Did he know me in some way? Was he aware of some individual impression of me as I was of him? Did he know things, deep and distant things, that only frogs, but not human beings, could know? This, of course, was all quite impossible to decipher because he was essentially inscrutable. But at the time, it was all part of the meditation on bullfrog, in which I regularly engaged. Though he was wholly and totally other, I felt connected to him, to say nothing of the fact that he lived next door. It was his spot, his place on the other side of the world, in what I had embraced as a part of my world. And he kept it under his quiet control and discretion, living a silent and contemplative life, shrouded in his damp and shadowy monastery. Conversations over those summers, as we whiled away hours on the swamp banks, often went like this. Hey, did you see bullfrog yet? Nah, but almost. Yeah, me too. Danny Tootin says he touched them yesterday. But he's lying. Yeah, he's lying. And so on. Catching bullfrog was a fantasy many of us had, the way catching a troll or a unicorn may have been for some, or seeing Bigfoot, an alien, or the Loch Ness Monster was for others. No, I don't think I truly wanted to capture him. It was, for me, a magnificent dream, that I wanted to remain a dream, the kind that if you wake from is gone, never to return in the same way. And I wanted to dream, to remain in my youthful, languid summer slumber. And I needed Bullfrog in the swamp to lay there with me, restful, in contented lethargy. Inevitably, kids fell off the rocks and into the swamp at least a few times each summer. You couldn't really drown, unless you were like 2 years old and panicked, forgetting that the water probably was not all the way over your head. Except if you landed in the very middle, and what the heck were you doing there anyway? But I've seen 4-year-olds extricate themselves from their impending watery graves through sheer determination and the power of their blood-curdling screams. And we'd always extend a stick or a belt to a little kid if he was standing there, chest deep, coated with green scum, and draped with salamander eggs, stuck in the mud, shaking and hollering that something unspecified entity had a hold of his leg or something. Those immersions were badges of merit and holy rites of passage. You'd hear kids say, even years later, I fell in once. It was weird. The swamp was a sort of turned-around fountain of youth. Once you went into it, you aged. Or at least your soul got older. Perhaps it was a kind of baptism by fire, reserved for us by Brother Bullfrog. One time, years later, Penny Rousseau fell through some of the snow-covered rocks that surrounded the swamp on a late December afternoon as the sky was darkening during a windless and heavy snowfall. I was in my driveway and thought I heard muffled cries beyond the snowbanks that framed our yard. And as I approached the swamp, I saw the tips of trembling, frost-covered fingers poking up through the frozen crust in a gap between two huge rocks. Being much older than she was, I was able to pull her straight up and out by the wrists. She emerged unexpectedly coatless, with her eyes popping out of her head. And the moment her toes hit the ground, she spun wordlessly and dashed across the street to her house, disappearing into the hush of thick snowflakes, crying, "Help, Mummy! Help! Mummy, help! I'm sorry!" These hysterics were in no small measure due to the fact that her mother was a colossal tyrant, a squint-eyed stick of a woman who was known in the neighborhood for the thrice daily ringing of a large handheld brass bell used to summon her nervous Pavlovian offspring home. And God forbid if the dog got there before those kids did, we could only imagine the hell there was to pay. Mrs. Rousseau was known over the years for yelling at her children and husband and other neighbors, and each of us kids at one time or another, for various infractions and infringements of which we had been entirely unaware prior to the ferocious bell-ringing accompanied reprimands we'd received. And it was an effective and disorienting method, I'll tell you. We could only stand there dumb and deafened during the ceremonial and clamorous chastisement. My mother referred to her as that lady with that friggin' bell. Evidently, Penny, while trapped in the crevice, had been hearing the bell's repeated and increasingly vigorous ringing, and it being the first time in her 9 years she hadn't run full tilt to her house, she must have assumed that she was dying or dead, trapped there in some kind of a gothic nightmare 30 yards from her front door. Mrs. Russo might have heard her daughter's plaintive cries if she'd only laid off clanging that infernal thing. I didn't see Penny around again till spring, when I witnessed her mother demonstrating bell-ringing techniques to her on the front steps, so she could qualify to summon her brother Gary, often known to be at large himself, and who accounted for most of the neighborhood cacophony. I believe the ordeal had proven too much for Penny, and she had taken to becoming a siren instead of an explorer, giving up her dream of a brave and adventurous life, putting it off for a while, or perhaps forever. Swamp experiences had a way of changing you. One summer afternoon, some big kids I didn't know, there were 3 of them, were at the swamp when I arrived, and they had just caught bullfrog. To me, it was as if they had discovered Atlantis, and I clicked into overdrive. "Hey, that's the frog!" I said, astonished and practically disoriented. "No shit, Sherlock," one of the boys answered. "Wow, can I see him?" "You got eyes, you can see him." He was not so dark after all, but a deep and vibrant green, with large teenage hands around his belly. He had stretched himself right out. Man, if he wasn't 18 inches long. I was already hypnotized when the boys began walking away from the swamp with him towards my house, which was odd to me, because I didn't know them, and doubted they even knew it was my yard they were walking into. I wondered why they'd be taking him anywhere. I couldn't fit the entire scene in my head. Bullfrog coming over to my place. Visiting his neighbor, kind of. What you doing? I asked, eager but somewhat agitated to be part of this momentous and auspicious occasion. "Just watch," one of them said authoritatively. They set Bullfrog down at the bottom edge of my front yard, and when I saw him there, out of his place and against the green of the grass, he seemed to change. Darker again, like in the water, but now smaller and stone still, never attempting a getaway, not the slightest effort to spring into flight, as was his typical course of action. Perhaps I imagined he was employing his wintertime competencies, his yogic trance, remaining in deep reserve. Perhaps it was something else that kept him there. Maybe some of that deep and distant knowledge I suspected he possessed, or possibly the same thing that held me there. As the boys hurriedly fumbled with their pockets, I could barely wrench my eyes from him, and only briefly glanced in the direction of the 3 others. Before I knew what was happening, one of them had forced open Bullfrog's mouth and jammed in a firecracker. Bullfrog remained ever motionless, accepting, apparently peaceful. He might have been in shock, but he just stood there in a wide stance, looking stable and strong. Now, I was gripped with anxiety. My legs shook. I felt woozy, but I knew I had to act. "Hey!" I started to move forward. "Hey, what?" "What are you going to do?" I asked, stopped in my tracks. "What do you think, jerk-off?" "No, don't!" I croaked. "Who is this fucking kid?" one of the others asked. "Never mind him," his friend said as they bent to their task. "Hey, wait!" I blurted out impotently. "Shut up!" one shouted. And I did. And the match was lit and put to the wick. I didn't fly to pull it out. I didn't yell for my mother. I didn't shout for help. I didn't fight for what I knew was right. I didn't do anything. I stood by, mute, frozen, afraid, and stupid. And it went off. And Bullfrog's head jerked up and came back with stunning speed. His mouth blew wide open, but he remained still, his eyes fixed straight ahead. I didn't know if he was dead standing there. I didn't know what was happening to him or me. The sound of the blast was deafening. Bullfrog's mouth remained hanging open. The aftershock and shrieking and hoo-has of the boys started coming in and hurt my head. I felt the sounds all through me now and thought I was going to fall right down there or throw up. And I raced back to the swamp, dissociated, smashing blind through the brambles. I hid by the rocks on the other side of the swamp, choking back my shame and rage-filled tears. Lying down on a low rock, holding my head, I saw my face reflected in the water darkly. Time passed, but to me it just hung there, not moving, not stopped, as I wildly thought about what I should have done. When I returned to my yard, there was no sign of the big kids or of Bullfrog. I frantically searched the spot on the grass and saw shreds of paper and a tiny impression where the detonation had occurred. I stumbled around confused and queasy. I had no idea what to do or where they went. I wanted to believe that he was okay and had taken off, hiding himself in the bushes, waiting for his time to go home. But I felt a sinking and certain knowledge that they had carried his shocked and injured body away to do it again, somewhere else, in order to finalize the deed, to get what they wanted from him, his suffering and his life. If he wasn't dead yet, I knew that soon he would be. And I also knew that I had been awakened and that the dream was over. No more youth. No more summer sleep. The bell had been rung for me now, but this one did not call me home. And soon I would have no choice but to climb through the ropes and into the war. I was too ashamed to tell anyone, afraid they'd ask what I did and why I didn't. My head hung down inside me after that, near a heart which leaked and burned. I hid because I let them wake me in. I let them take me in. I handed myself over to them, and so I hid. And now, half a century later, I carry his weight and meditate on him still. His sacrifice and my lack of strength contributed to my fantasy of becoming an avenging angel, protecting the helpless, coming to the rescue of the disenfranchised, standing up against abuses of power. I tried to do these things, but not frequently and seldom well. In fact, most often I've had regrets about the parts I've played, overreacting unnecessarily and inappropriately, or when real action was called for, freezing, never enough, not nearly enough to rinse the guilt from my hands. 5 years after Bullfrog's passing, a Buddhist monk self-immolated in Southeast Asia on June 11, 1963, in a protest against the brutal oppression by the Catholic regime in power in Vietnam. The monk had prepared for months in meditation, and at a busy intersection, his fellow monks poured gasoline on him, and then he lit the match. It was an act of tremendous courage and a sign to the world that he and his brothers could withstand any pain for the sake of his people. It was the most powerful image I had ever seen, and it brought back the stalwart and resolute figure of Bullfrog, standing firm in the face of his oppressors, and it also recalled my passivity in the face of his courage. The New York Times reporter who was present at the Vietnam burning wrote, "I was to see that sight again, but once was enough. Flames were coming from a human being. His body was withering and shriveling up, his head blackening and charring. In the air was the smell of burning flesh. Human beings burned surprisingly quickly. Behind me I could hear the sobbing of the Vietnamese who were now gathering. I was too shocked to cry, too confused to take notes or ask questions, too bewildered to even think. As he burned, he never moved a muscle, never uttered a sound, his outward composure in sharp contrast to the wailing people around him. The story goes that even after the incident, though he was cremated in Buddhist tradition, his heart would still not burn, and is therefore considered holy, and has since been in the custody of the Reserve Bank of Vietnam. This was the strength and power Bullfrog demonstrated to me in my boyhood. The passion and empathy invoked in me by him and the monk was unforgettable, immeasurable, bottomless. The monk who gave his life was a hero to me, as was Bullfrog before him. And so the swamp was irrevocably transformed for me on that my 10th summer. But I continued to visit, sitting on the rocks at its edge for years after, staring at the water, seeing my changing face reflected back, as I did on that day when I first saw my shame and sorrow in the swamp's mirror. In speaking with my brother about those days, he said, "You know, a lot of that swamp still existed even after the McAllisters built their house on that lot. More than half the swamp was still out in their backyard. Then they built their swimming pool and that killed the rest of it." A moment later he said, "Hey, I wonder where it is, the swamp. It's got to be under there somewhere, no?" "Yeah," I replied, "it's got to be." I did not mention that, although the swamp itself is gone, I keep it with me. My piece of the other side of the world. Perhaps I hang on to it in the hope that it will prevent my heart from burning up. And I have maintained my position on the rocks. The picture in the water continues to be my dark reflections, of which I seem tireless. But since that summer in the swamp swims an image of Bullfrog, which from time to time extends into full view, breaking the still surface, disturbing the static reflection, contorting and twisting it until it becomes more real, more me. In memoriam, Bullfrog. Summer 1958. Tick, calling dark. Summer 1963.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight. This has been an incredible night. Thank you.